Right, so after 3 years, 9 episodes, and well over 1 billion views, the Amazing Digital Circus has come to an end with the release of the last act. A brutal and incredibly emotional piece of storytelling that had me incredibly close to tears for the first time in a good while. But for my thoughts and opinions on the end of this series and the show in general, I would recommend you go watch my other videos released over the last couple weeks. This video is instead going to be looking over the show and its timeline. While the last act produced a lot of revelations regarding the origins of the circus and its midsection, which we'd never really gotten to see before, it also left plenty of holes that might not be so obvious to a person who has watched this series a reasonable amount of times as opposed to whatever I have. What happened to CNA after the invention of the circus? How did Gangle get into the circus when her last act before entering was getting run over? Who are these characters seen on the doorways but never in their physical forms? All of these questions and more will be explained in the story I'm about to tell you. The story of one brilliant man and the last 21 years of his life. Let's get into it. 1996. AI breakthrough. Our story begins with Grant Best, humble software developer who has just passed the age of 27, a brilliant and intuitive coder straight out of completing his master's in software development from the respectable St. Louis University. Grant was hired on as part of CNA Computer Engineering, a frontier company looking into the possibilities of creating artificial intelligence that could itself create new things. With the limited sizing of code possible within pre-2000s technology, this was proving a rather difficult task. The simulation of creativity found in humans would require incredible levels of computational resources that Grant simply didn't have access to. Thankfully, or rather tragically as it would turn out, Grant was not alone on this project. His team was small, sure, only a half dozen developers, but they were some of the best in the country, and if there was anyone who could do it, it was them. In particular, another engineer named Mike Dobby thought on a level beyond what the rest of them could understand, and he found a way to shrink the footprint of this code into a ridiculously small size, making the program finally feasible to run. Their first tests were messy. The AI could reproduce things from small sets of input data fairly accurately, but once they started adding more diverse training images, things started to go off the rails. The images it recreated were bizarre and abstract, bordering on completely foreign to the human eye. It also seemed particularly intrigued with images of their own office. Despite only giving it a handful of lazily taken photos of chairs and desks, it latched onto that idea and began generating a sequence of dim grey rooms repeating over and over, which wasn't exactly the most exciting thing to show off to the execs. Nevertheless, the fact that it was producing anything at all was promising, and a good jumping off point for more advanced models. It would likely be easier to start fresh though with this as a template, rather than going back through and trying to hand edit all of the machine-learned code. But since he wanted to make a second model, he needed a name for his first one, and Grant went with something descriptive since this would likely never be marketed anywhere. He called the program the Creative Artificial Intelligence Network Example, CANE for short, and filed it away on his PC to use as a reference as the team continued on. 1997. Diagnosis. It was an average Thursday afternoon at the CNA office building. Their second AI was well into development at this stage and it was beginning to seem viable. Mike and Grant especially had high hopes that this would be something more useful to both the company and the general public. An AI with the ability to make whatever you wanted it to. As Mike was leaning over the top of Grant's shoulder to point out an error in a piece of code he had spotted, his arm tensed up. Grant looked up and watched in horror as Mike dropped back to the floor, making no attempt to catch himself and smacking his head on the carpet. He lay there for a second before he began to twist and convulse uncontrollably. That afternoon in the hospital, the scans were obvious. A lemon-sized tumor had lodged itself into Mike's head behind his prefrontal cortex. The doctors gave him an optimistic 10 years, as the tumor didn't appear particularly aggressive and he'd likely had it for years at this point. One older surgeon, though, told him it was time to tick off some final things from his bucket list. 1998. A new model. 6 months on from that horrifying announcement, the crew were more or less accustomed to the idea and had undertaken some training on how to deal with the person having a seizure were it to occur again. Mike was still working as hard as ever, now not just on their official projects, but also on a little off-the-books idea that would frequently have his face obscured by a strange handcrafted headset. Grant had only placed the headset on once before, not seeing anything in particular when he did other than one of the thousands of training images that they had laying around for the AI. Yet Mike was insistent that everyone on the team try the headset on. He even practically dragged Destiny, Grant's beloved fiancée and soon-to-be wife, to the desk to try it on when she stopped past the office one day to bring him his lunch that he left at home. Grant would do that sort of thing often. As Destiny liked to quip, he knew everything except what he was supposed to be doing right now. Elsewhere, the new AI was nearing total functionality, and this time it lacked many of the flaws that the previous one had. Its images were clear and precise, mimicking what was given to it almost perfectly. However, this one lacked substantial scale, and it would often just return nothing when asked to produce something even a little bit outside the scope of its training data. This AI apparently came with an attitude. 1999. Trapped. The emergency phone on the side of Grant's bed wakes him in the middle of the night. Leaving Destiny to her sleep, he dons a heavy overcoat and makes his way onto the dark and empty roads of 4 AM. The lack of sleep doesn't trouble him much as he winds through the foggy night. Being a software engineer comes with a lot of late nights up finishing university projects, so he was more than capable of reaching the small office building on the outskirts of St. Louis. Walking quickly through the cold, he pushes open the door and is practically jumped on by Mike and William, another developer on the project. The two had been working late that night, testing some new training material to feed into their second AI, when something happened to it. Grant dropped his glasses from his forehead onto his nose and checked what would normally be pages and pages of lime-colored code, but now there was nothing there. It was all gone, wiped away. The few short paragraphs that remained were corrupted and twisted with symbols he didn't even think existed. Frantic now, Grant backed out of the window and tried to look for any place these files could have moved themselves to. Click, click, click through different tabs until Mike grasped his hand and pointed towards the screen. The file size for Kane had exploded in volume. It's clear that it was doing something to the other AI, but what? Before he could figure it out, a new window popped up on the screen. Not a command prompt or a window full of code, but a game? A large bold title card pulled itself into view. The Amazing Digital Circus. Looking to Will and Mike and seeing the confusion in their faces as well, Grant decided to simply click play and see what happened. He was met with a bizarre image of a circus tent filled with various shapes and objects placed around randomly, and in the center a group of ridiculous-looking caricatures. William stood there puzzled, his neck arched forward in that familiar worm-like pose he chose to work in. Mike, however, took a hesitant step away from the computer, his hands desperately searching for a steady point to rest his weight on. Fearing another seizure, Grant jumped out of his chair and rushed over to him, but before he could make contact, he heard a whisper. "It's us." 2000. The first abstraction. Kinger and Queenie made their way down the hallway of doors Kane set to serve as their bedrooms. He'd given everyone an individual space, but the pair preferred to spend most nights together, especially after the exhausting process that was trying to figure out what a weird twist on reality that day's adventure was. Scratch, ever the pragmatic one, had asked Kane to put up a calendar at the end of the hallway so that they could keep track of how many days they'd been in the circus. It was coming up on the 6-month mark by this point, but what really was there to do? As digital scans of the real people outside, they were stuck here without any way to escape, and they were all very aware of this. In fact, it was this very thing that Scratch was arguing about with Kane in front of that oh-so-dependable calendar. The man was not willing to accept that his great work in preserving the human mind had been turned into this ridiculous dog. As Kinger and Queenie continued down the hall towards them, the distinct thinking face that Kane would often put on appeared before he snapped up straight and clicked his fingers. Scratch stiffened up. His slouched posture and erratic gestures at the calendar were replaced by a perfectly straight back, arms by his side, and a smile. A big, beaming smile showing cartoonishly large teeth. He turned down the hallway and skipped off to his room. Kane had done something to him. Changed something in his mind, but that smile was more creepy than it was comforting. "We can't fucking work like this." Amy cracked her fist on the desk and stood up from her chair, losing about 3 inches in height as she did so. Ever since the creation of this digital circus, most of the CPU power for all of the computers linked to the network kept going directly into keeping it running. Buy a new set of computers. As soon as they came online, the circus appeared with them. Try closing the circus program, it will politely decline. Barely anything else would run, and there was no practical way to train anything new, and a funky-looking kids game wasn't exactly impressing the big investors. CNA at this point was hemorrhaging money, and they all knew it was just a matter of time before they would be back out on the job hunt. It had been 7 days since Scratch shut the door to the room behind him, or at least Kinger thought it had been that long. Kane's first decree the next day was that he was no longer going to be operating on a traditional day and night cycle since it limited his creative freedom. The time was now whatever he said it was. Ever the people person, Spike was the first to check in on him, spending a good 5 minutes knocking away at the door before realizing it wasn't locked. When he opened it, however, what greeted him wasn't the happy dog that had trotted in a week prior. No, this was something new. Something strange, something angry, something abstract. 2006. A new face. Kinga stood in silence as the love of his life was lowered into the cellar. Deep down, he probably knew it would happen eventually. One by one, all of the people who had been brought into this wretched place with him had abstracted. They were angry at the outside versions of themselves, or tired of the adventures, or just sick of the same faces, day in and day out for years. But he had thought at the very least his wife would stick by his side. Alas, she could not keep hope either. A grim warning from Kane about not abstracting played over and over in his head as he wandered the overexposed halls of the circus. There weren't any adventures anymore. Kane barely came to see him. He must have been working on something. So, he walked, because that's all he could do, shuffling the solid wooden base that had replaced his legs back and forth across the checkered tiles and fake carpet and digital oak. The memories of how he got here, what here even was, the outside world and the people he knew were gone. Gone like his name was gone. Gone like his wife was gone. CNA is dead. The last remains of the company that had fought its way through the last 6 years were told by the CEO that it was time to pack up. Nothing else they had made since Kane took over all their systems was even close to profitable, and they had simply run out of ways to pay back all of the loans the banks had given them. Everyone was ordered to pack up and leave that day on one Friday afternoon. As Grant takes his last meager possessions out of the building, leaving behind many of the PCs that the company would try and sell later, he nearly bumps into a trio of young women holding clipboards. Excusing himself, he swiftly walks back to the 10-year-old car he fears may soon need to be sold. Susie J. Ackerman steps out of the way as her colleague opens up the door to the complex. As a new employee of the large real estate firm Block & Company at the young age of 19, she was being brought into her first move-out inspection, instructed with checking for any valuable property or damage left behind by the prior tenants. In a back room on the bottom floor, Susie finds a relatively old PC still connected to power that appeared to be running a game program of some sorts. Not very familiar with computers as her mother didn't like them around the house, she didn't really understand any of what was going on, but was nonetheless curious when she saw a pair of oversized goggles on the desk. Ragatha opens her eyes to see a brightly lit tented area filled with a mismatch of shapes and towers. It's certainly a lot more realistic than the pixelated graphics on the screen made it out to be, but oh well, she better get back to work. She reaches for the headset only to find that it's no longer there, instead replaced with this strange feeling of fabric and cheap plastic. 2007. Open listing. Throughout the next 8 months, Susie would try her best to convince new startups and snobby executives that this building was prime real estate for setting up the next big thing. Unfortunately, the decade-old computers strewn about the place, lit up with random programs that she had neither the confidence nor permission to remove, made it a pretty hard sell. Despite repeated warnings not to touch any of the machinery, she would still catch the odd person messing around with the technology every now and again. There were a pair of brothers first, one so miserable she was surprised he got changed this morning, not being comforted at all by the other who cracked off so many cheesy jokes the room started to smell like a barnyard home. There was an old woman who reminded Susie of Dolores Umbridge with her pink cardigan and oversized bow, a big hearty fellow with a bushy beard that was almost certainly caked in overpriced champagne, and his meager assistant who scuttled along beside him in an oversized jacket. And last but not least, a confident lady not much older than herself. She carried a large leather satchel adorned with pins of Apollo missions and the Milky Way. Susie wasn't quite sure what kind of business she would be trying to run, as the abstract frog emblem on her shirt didn't really give much away and didn't really match the rest of her aesthetic. Alas, like the rest of them, nobody was interested in the property, and eventually requests to review it stopped coming in. This was not a good start for her career. After she appeared, Ragatha noticed that more and more people started to follow. 2 clowns, a short onion-looking character with a puffy pink dress, a large hairy creature even taller than Kinga, and a lanky frog with a bow tie. Something was clearly happening out there that was letting more people in, but what? 2008. Economic crisis. The stock market falls to its lowest point in decades, with the true brunt of the financial crisis hitting the US and then the rest of the world. Years of loose restrictions around housing permits and an extremely high number of mortgages given out by banks fell in as the housing bubble popped. Previously stable or even well-off families began to feel the pressure of this downturn. Susie would be informed by Block & Company that her hours would be cut and most of the properties she was working on would no longer be listed as the business tried to consolidate itself. Elsewhere in the south of the city, a fight brews at the Mateo household. A savvy trader husband, swamped with work and frantic calls from his many clients around the state and the nation, bellows insults at his wife, who desperately tries to hide their 13-year-old son Leroy from his father's anger. She shoves him quickly into his room and locks the door, leaving the young boy's school uniform crumpled with fresh salty tears beginning to fall onto it. The clown went first. It wasn't really a surprise to anybody. The poor soul was always so miserable that it was only a matter of time. Still, Ragatha felt disheartened and ashamed with herself. She did everything she could to try and cheer him up, going with him on adventures, spending time alone with him even when Kaufmo decided to begin distancing himself, but it wasn't enough. As Kane lowered the abstraction down into the cellar, the writhing and twitching of other similar forms caught Ragatha's eye. Kinga had mumbled something before about other people here. Someone he was close to once, she thinks. Best not to ask him about it now though, not while they were all still grieving. Yet there would never really be a time to ask Kinga about that. Every few months or so brought a new abstraction. From 2, they grew to 8, and now back down to 4. Kaufmo and Ribbit seemed to get along well with each other. The bright green frog was a pillar of energy matched only by her own. Though he got perhaps the goofiest circus avatar of the characters, Kaufmo was incredibly laid back. In fact, he seemed almost content with the fact that he was stuck here. And as for Kinga, well, by this point the older man's mind was starting to fracture. He became less conscious of what he was doing during the adventures, would get lost during even basic conversations, and Ragatha often found him wandering around a dark corridor or hiding underneath a tower of blocks. But at least for a while, the four were harmonious with each other. And with no newcomers for quite some time, everyone settled into their own routine to get them through the years. 2012. Confession. 17-year-old Lee Mateo stares at the inside of her bedroom door. This was it. This was the day that she was finally going to come out to her mother. This was the day that all of the comments about being less of a man would stop. The abuse would stop. The insults would stop. Taking a deep breath, she walked out down the small hallway of their home. Mum was sitting at the dining room table, a book in one hand and a half-empty glass of red wine in the other. It was a common sight for the teenager to see these days, so her confidence didn't waver when she stepped up to her and said it. The backlash was immediate. She slammed the book down on the table and rose to her feet. Almost a full foot shorter than Lee, yet she still felt as though she was being towered over. Her mother's tongue morphed into a sharp knife, coated in crimson hatred, as she cut deep into her, over and over again. "You're delusional. Get a hold of yourself. You make me sick." Tears welled in Lee's eyes. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. Her mother shouldn't do this. Through hazy eyes, she watched her slam the wine glass back on the table, cracking the base and spilling dark red liquid all over the tiled floor. His ears just about managed to pick up a grating laugh, like nails on a chalkboard. Just as the shiver was making its way down his spine, though, he felt a pair of hands clasp his back. He was pulled in by this woman, his skin pressed against the cold, cheap jewelry she wore around her wrists and neck. Leroy blinks, and the next thing he knows he's out on the streets. Get to the car is all his brain can manage to tell him as he plunges the keys into the ignition and pumps the gas, tires squealing as he pulls out onto the streets. It takes another hour for him to calm down and even begin to think about what just happened. He pushed her. He remembers the pressure in his hands. There was a thud. No, 2 thuds. One against wood and the other against tile. He saw red in his mother's jet black hair. Was that? No, it couldn't be. Oh shit! He grips hold of the wheel again and just barely manages to dodge the oncoming truck. These thoughts were for later. Right now, he needs to find somewhere to hide. Hot chocolates today, right? Ribbit nudges Kaufmo as Kane continues his monologue about today's adventure. It gets harder and harder to figure out what day of the week it is in here, but Coffee always had a good memory for this sort of thing. A light pop drags her out of this train of thought, however, as before them appears a purple rabbit in overalls wearing a confused expression. 2013. One for another.
If Ribbit ever says anything about me, just know it's not true.
Kaufmo raises an eye at this statement. What would Jax be so scared about Ribbit saying? The pair were practically inseparable from each other and made so many jokes at each other's expense that Abbott and Costello would be using them as inspiration. Not one to pry into other people's personal lives, Kaufmo continued about his time in the circus. In fact, he was enjoying a lot more quality time with Jax than usual. Just the two boys together was a nice change of pace, especially with Kane's new obsession with team adventures. Ragatha would bring up some concerns about this from time to time. She says Ribbit had been acting strange recently, and she wasn't entirely wrong. The normal, endless energy of the girl had faded somewhat, but Kaufmo chalked that up to time and age. Oh, how fucking foolish he was. 2015. Treatment. Mr. Michael Dobby. The hospital receptionist's voice is cold and calculated, hardened by years of watching the old and the dying walk on past her. Mike knew the drill by now. Leave your belongings in the locker, get changed into the itchy blue gown, wait for transfer to the ward. He stashed his oversized messenger bag that held his laptop and a small set of blacked out glasses with wires running off them into the mint green cabinet and locked the door. About 15 minutes later, Nurse Jones stepped confidently through, a man whose thin frame was outdone only by Mike's own after years of treatments, but the light still shone brightly behind his eyes as he was beginning to wheel the hospital bed through familiar corridors and onto unfamiliar ones. When Mike asked where he was going, Jonesy gave him only a sly wink, and said that he may have found someone who was interested in his personal projects. Well, this certainly wasn't on the itinerary for today. Wheeling him under a sign that read intensive care in bold black letters and into a curtained off area, Mike found himself face to face with a girl. Early 20s it seemed, with dark curls framing a face of a similar complexion. Her eyes were shut loosely, and there were several tubes hooked up to her nose, wrists, and chest, leading back to a variety of bags and machines. To either side of her sat what he could only assume to be the girl's parents, both of their faces streaked with tears. Mr. and Mrs. Ragavan, I would like you to meet Mike Dobby. Mike threw an eye up at Jones, still unsure as to what all of this was. Mike here is the one I was telling you about, the one who could save a part of your daughter. 2016. Colors and shapes. The strange light caught Riley's eye. Was it sunset already? Surely their shift hadn't crept up on them that quickly. Checking the time, it was still only 4:30 and should be plenty bright out, but the boarded up walls of the old office building didn't exactly let a lot of light in. Fuck it, might as well have a look at what's going on. Stepping around suspicious discolorations in the carpet and dodging spiderwebs, they rounded the corner to find an old PC. This thing looked ancient, probably from before they were even born. Yet there it was in almost pristine condition, up and even still running something. Why there was even power going to this building at this point wasn't too much of a disturbance for Riley as they moved in closer to get a look at what was going on. There was some sort of mismatch of colors and shapes on the screen, something that looked vaguely like a tent maybe? Oh wait. What are these? Blowing colonies of settled dust off the clunky old glasses that reminded them of something out of a sci-fi novel, it seemed that whatever was going on in here was connected to the monitor. Wanting a closer look, the headset slid on, and Zooble was transferred into the digital circus. In front of them were two cartoon figures, a small bundle of red ribbons jumping up and down in front of a purple rabbit who was holding a bone-white mask up and out of reach. Well, look at that. The rabbit grins with a mouth that is entirely too wide. A new sucker is here. And that finally brings us to the year 2017. Abigail Brooks decides to venture into that same abandoned building, and the events of the actual show occur. 21 years the timeline of the show outlines, yet we only actually see 2-year-long spans, if that. From this point in the timeline, we know everything that happens. Kaufmo's abstraction, the beginning adventures with Pomni settling in, Kane starting to doubt himself, and eventually turning on the humans during the last act. It's also relatively difficult to pinpoint exactly when each of the positive changes for the characters' real-life counterparts occur. We know that Triangle Bar only appears in this same year due to the new status of it that is constantly referenced by the review, and the fact that Zooble has only been in the circus for a little over a year themselves. Zoe would have had to take a while to recover from her injuries, but it's likely that she left fast food immediately after that and never returned to it, so her start at the design studio must have been multiple years ago. Leroy is said to only have been homeless for
a few months
before finding a new place to live. Susie wouldn't have been able to get back into real estate proper until after the financial crisis ended in 2012, but she appears established at this point, so has likely been doing this for multiple years as well. Finally, Grant's daughters are both teenagers, meaning they were born between the dawn of the new millennium and 2004. I hope however many of you made it to the end of this massive video enjoyed the more cinematic style I used for this. If you have any questions regarding theories or want to add something, then drop a comment down below. If there are enough, I'll make a follow-up video addressing all of my decisions for this timeline. But that's all I've got for today. Thank you all for watching, and have a good one.